Welcome to the workshop. Hi. Today I'm cutting a dovetail halving joint. Now it's a lap joint like the one we did earlier in the series. A half lap where half of the material has been removed from one component and half from the other, and then when they're joined together they fit nice and flush. But in the case of the dovetailed lap, instead of having a straight joint line, we cut it in the shape of a dovetail. And this gives the joint mechanical strength to prevent it being pulled apart in this direction. I've got two components here. They're identical thicknesses and widths and squared and planed all round. I'm going to join this one to that one. I'll do it in the shape of a inverted T. And I've got a little dovetail marker. So if I say it's going to be there, use my square to line them up nicely. Make a mark at the front edge, remove the component and make a mark on the other edge, and if I pencil that in you can see roughly where we are going to be putting the components. So it's going to be roughly in that area. Now I think you can see that the actual dovetail will be on this component, and we need the socket for the dovetail in the top half of this component. So we shall be removing material in that area down to half depth, and on this one we will be removing material from here to create the dovetail. So we also need to mark out the shoulders of the dovetail, which will be equal to the thickness of the other piece of material. So we can use the engineer's square as an abutment, push those tight up against it, and we can mark that shoulder line there, and I'll just square that across with the tri-square. That's just a light line. Now I can use my dovetail marker and we'll line up the end of the component with the edge of the dovetail so we get the largest joint surface area that we can, and then I'll knife that line down to the shoulder line. And I'll pencil it in so it's easy to see. And then I need to do the same on the other side. And now I'm going to mark in the shoulder lines deeper from the point of the dovetail. And I think you can see this is the material we'll be removing. I'll mark those shoulders around the rest of the component. on the back side of the dovetail we remove all the material for half the thickness. That's why I've put the shoulder line, I've knifed the shoulder line in thickly right across. And just join up the last side. Now taking a marking gauge, I want to set it for half the thickness of the components. Now I can mark round from the shoulder line on the side, across the end and back down the other side. Marking from the face edge. In actual fact, I've started my marking from opposite the face edge. I know it's perfectly parallel, so I shall make sure on the other component I mark from the other edge as well. Now I'm ready to cut away the rear half of this end. Just put the pencil line onto our knife line. And we can remove our little wedge. And cut away our waste. Into my knife line, vertically push it down. And just clean that out. Now to ensure we've got exactly the right depth, I did saw inside my knife line, so I know there's some more material to take away. I'm going to pop this in the vise and use the router plane to bring me down to the knife line. You could obviously use a chisel, difficulty of making one in such a small piece of material is there's not much room to hold the router plane base down, and if you're making the joint on some larger material you'd actually find it easier. And that's good. Now I've completed that using the router plane, brought it down to my knife line. That's lovely flat surface. Now we can set about cutting out the dovetail. We place it back in our vise. I like to set the angle roughly approximating that of the dovetail so that I'm cutting straight down. And then cut just outside our knife line. and then we can finish up to our knife line by using a chisel and paring away the excess material. As we get close to our knife line, we want to transfer onto the top of the bench so that we can make sure we're taking vertical cuts. And we want to put a bit of support underneath where we've lapped. So we can feed our chisel into the knife line and just press down, keeping it nice and vertical. Work my way along to the corner. And then just clean out the corner. And pop it back into the vise for a final little clean up of the shoulders. And that's our one component completed. Now I need to lay out for the dovetail socket on the other component. I've put a couple of spacers underneath the end of the dovetailed component to bring it up, bring the lap section level with where the socket's going to be. Now I can push the shoulder up tight with it lined up against the initial layout marks we put. That's good. Then we can lay out the shape of the socket we need to make. And once again I'll do that with a marking knife. And I'm going fairly light at the moment because the bevel is on the non-waste side of the line, so I don't want to create too much of a valley on that side. So I'm just putting a thin knife line in to mark out the dovetail socket. Now I can transfer the shoulder lines from that marking down the joint face. And first of all, if I go back to my marking gauge, I want to gauge off the depth of my half lap in that area. So between these two marks, I'll gauge a depth line. And then I want to bring down square the shoulder lines for the dovetail, which is there. And there. I'll just go on my knife lines with a pencil so you can see them clearly. That's the material we need to remove at this end. At the other end, I can put in another depth mark. Now on the outside of the joint, I can mark back to my half width distance to mark the end of the dovetail. And on this side, that's the material that needs to be removed. And if I mark in down the knife line here, and just to the waist side of the knife line with a pencil, that material is what has to go. So I'm going to make 2 saw marks down the slope lines down to half depth, chisel out most of the waste and use a router plane to take it down to exactly halfway. Now I've just left the knife line, so I can put my chisel on the knife line, make a vertical cut, now that's fitting quite nicely, so I'll glue that up and we can come back and clean it up with a plane afterwards. Don't need an awful lot of glue on here. The main surfaces are where we've got the long grain. The end grain isn't going to really do much at all. The possible advantage you do get by putting it on the end grain is it's slightly gap filling, and it will make that dovetail just a little bit tighter. I'll put a bit of glue also on the flat of the tail. And we'll just put a clamp across there and leave it for a couple of hours. A few clean-up strokes with the plane, remembering the grain orientation and skewing our blade. And soon our joint is beginning to look quite nice. And our joint's complete. Nice tight joint lines all the way around, and a nice dovetail. the Dovetail Halving joint. Give it a go.